Seventh Vox Log of Arbites Investigative Alex Awareness, 896, 995, and 41. Penetrating into the rear rooms of the Crown Prince's palace, Blackwater and I had a run-in with a bladder-bearing servant who careened into us around a blind corner. While the disoriented man picked up his tray and scattered hors d'oeuvres, a third member of our cell slipped in behind us, Maxime, seemingly having capitalized on Norstrike's distraction as well. Making our way up the staircase that the food had come flying down, we came upon a long hallway with numerous doors along the south wall opposite tall, ornate windows in the north. Halfway down this 50 or so meter stretch, a pair of carapace armored enforcers stood watch at one of the doors. To our immediate right, we discerned the household's kitchen, a well-appointed affair filled with the sounds and aromas of various servants preparing the many hundreds of servings necessary for the night's function. Recognizable above everything else was the head chef, large and swarthy, with a booming voice as he directed his underlings around the chamber. Blackwater and Maxime moved in to speak with him as I waited back in the hallway, something in the manicured garden outside catching my eye through the window. Glinting from the soft blue-white glow of an illuminator suspended above the space, clearly imitating moonlight, was fine jewelry hanging from the neck of a particularly well-dressed woman. She was sitting on a bench, footwear removed and the hem of her expensive dress dripping with moisture. She gazed pensively over a water feature. After a few moments of leering, I was able to recognize her as Crown Princess Noikova, her likeness familiar from all of the propaganda posters announcing the pending coronation ceremonies plastered up and down every level of the Hive Dome. She cut a rather alluring figure, if I'm to be honest, and I had difficulty looking away as my fellow acolytes exited the kitchen. Having learned little of use from the head chef, I pointed the noblewoman out to them before we continued east down the hallway. I caught the attention of one of the enforcers as we passed by the door that they were guarding, metallic and out of place among all the ornamentation. Masquerading as a guest of the 2,224th Regiment's commander, Hyrule Vanguard, I asked the guard where we might find the other militarum officers. He gestured down to the last threshold on the right, where I could see the light pouring out through the propped-open double doors and hear the sound of rapidly clashing steel. Entering the room, we witnessed the end of a duel between a pair of Romarian staff officers, the loser nursing a bleeding gash on the back of his hand as he sheathed his saber and returned to the ranks of spectators. He looked to be the most senior of the bunch, with ornate epaulets and a dense cluster of medals occupying his breast. Deciding that participation would be the quickest way to ingratiate ourselves, Blackwater threw his hat in the ring for the next bout, selecting a sword from one of the many weapon racks about the chamber before stepping up to the previous fight's victor. I'm no fencer, even if I know how to swing a shock maul in the facilitation of crowd dispersal, so I can't really do the exchange that followed much credit. Hilaire was clumsy with his strikes, but kept a solid footing and a low center of gravity that his Romarian opponent was incapable of knocking off balance. Our Corsair took one superficial hit, but the Romarian took three that left him unconscious and bleeding profusely. As the wounded man was dragged out of the room, Blackwater received applause and congratulations from the rest of the native officers, who were subsequently introduced. Before the conversation could continue, the brigadier excused the group after consulting a pocket chrono and exited the chamber with the subordinates in tow. Glancing out after them, I could see them disappearing down a narrower hallway to the south towards another plasteel security door that they passed through after interacting with some kind of biometric device. Coming down the main hall was who could only be Grand Prince Frolov himself. He walked with a slight limp in his right leg, with a fine pale blue cloak draped over an ornate white uniform adorned with several large medals. He turned down a different southern hallway, and it took little stretching of the imagination to conclude that a high-level meeting was about to begin. Hurrying back into the dueling chamber, we were able to spot an air vent set into the low-vaulted ceiling. Giving Maxime a boost, Bright Eyes slithered his way into what can only be described as his natural environment, hard, dark shafts. Setting his micro-bead to continuous transmission, I waited with Blackwater in the center of the fighting room as we both listened to our infiltrator's progress. Several minutes later, he found himself above the correct ventilation grill, thumbed on his pick recorder, and began listening in on the conversation below. What followed was irrefutable evidence of a seditious plot between the Grand Prince and a cadre of loyal military commanders. A gruff voice we hadn't heard before recited the timetable of a 1 Operation Platinum, set to commence in 5 days. A coup d'etat, preceded by some kind of bomb attack at 2100 hours on the day of, is to involve an advance by the Romarian Third Corps, assaulting the royal palace from the east and slaying the entirety of King Stepanov's family by midnight. After some additional spoken review of various duties and subtasks for the subordinate formations, it seemed like the meeting was beginning to adjourn. Maxime made his way back through the vent shafts and plopped back down into the dueling room just in time for a guard to retrieve us and usher everyone back towards the main hall. As we passed the kitchen, I noticed Princess Norkova still in her plaintive reverie down amongst the botanical gardens. If only she knew. Rejoining Prince Zienkov and the rest of our cell at Interrogator Marn's table, Captain Norstrike was notably absent. A hush then fell over the dinner audience as the Grand Prince emerged from behind the stage with the same staff officers we had just met a quarter of an hour before. There was one man, however, we hadn't seen, another officer, but adorned in a predominantly blue dress uniform with a low stub hanging from his lips. Launching into his speech, Frolov announced his intention to seek re-election by the Chamber of Princes, described a spate of new treaties and trade agreements, and then turned his attention to Zienkov himself, calling him out as a dutiful follower, and describing how his father's death and the subsequent acquisition of the Laz Lens Cutters Guild had been a fortuitous one. The young noble was incredibly flustered by this portion of the address, whispering that this had not been a part of the speech draft that he had received. As the Grand Prince stepped away from the podium, the officer in blue took his place and announced himself as one Colonel Nikolai Pavlovich. It was around this time that Norstrike got back in touch with us via microbead, explaining he'd set up at a remote listening post somewhere on the palace grounds. As he attempted to assume direct control over a servo skull, still serving as our table's centerpiece, he exhibited irritation at some kind of electronic interference preventing him from a picked or Vox feed through the thing. Then we heard gunfire from his end. Then the Blue Colonel, on the center stage, announced to the crowd the presence of interlopers within the gala as he looked at our table. And then all hell broke loose. We leapt to our feet, Garn threw Zienkov to the floor, then our witch focused the roiling energies of his tainted mind into a lance of powerful electricity that blew out the armor glass of the nearest window some 10 meters to our south. He also sank a burst of warp lightning into the hapless Strakops the 12th sitting in front of said window, incinerating his arms and killing the portly man instantly in a sizzling crackle of cooking fat. It was a good thing I hadn't eaten anything that night. I made for the window, making an attempt to haul Elias Marn after me, figuring that her mental faculties were still compromised by her mind wipe. She wrenched her wrist out of my grip with surprising strength, and as I continued towards the improvised exit, she raised and fired a hitherto hidden crossbow at Pavlovich. Her bolt struck a refractor field, but powered through and lodged itself in his chest before detonating in a shower of gore. Now, the screaming started. Blackwater grabbed Zienkov as the rest of us flung ourselves out the window. House guards began drawing pistols and peppering the opening in a miniature blizzard of powdered stone and plaster, but the Corsair was able to finally dive out with our terrified and bewildered nobleman in tow. Suddenly, Blackwater's auto carriage crashed to the front entrance of the dining hall, a heavy stubber pounding out a vicious staccato of fire that sighed down house guardsmen and dinner guests alike. Boxing our location, it veered southwards and drove through that wall as well, that we were now behind. We saw Hellstruck, Xenos, and Hilaire's goons inside the dented and pockmarked vehicles we clambered in. Taking the wheel, Hilaire got us back out the front entrance and out onto the primary driveway, a hail of solid projectiles and las fire raking the rear of the van. Valkyries took off from hidden landing pads around the estate, but their powerful stab lights missed us as we careened through the gates and checkpoints. Approaching the final exit, which appeared more alert and better armed, Blackwater slowed to flash his inquisitorial signet ring at the guard sergeant who beckoned us to stop. While playing our trump card was always something I've wanted to avoid, the effect was admittedly satisfying and nearly instantaneous. The road barricade was immediately removed for us, and the cell peeled out of there with all the torque an 8-cylinder Prometheum inline can muster. My ears are still ringing from that damned heavy stubber. Our pursuers shaken, Grey-Bast announced the discovery of another psychic presence, most likely the wizard of the Zienkov household, remotely parasitizing the young prince's senses, seeing and hearing what he saw and heard. We subsequently black-bagged him, though I doubt that helped his nerves much. Dark then tried something with his mind, I'm not sure what, but with a pained scream he clutched his temples as the hair on the back of my neck stood up straight. A sudden crash followed, all of the windows in Blackwater's vehicle shattering outwards, and it's a credit to the Corsair that he didn't lose control and wipe out. Once he'd calmed himself, the witch asked Marn for something, and after a few moments she passed up that odd obsidian cylinder we'd seen upon first making her acquaintance. With a twist of the object and another pained yell, he tossed the thing back towards us, and explained that it needed to be presented to Iosif. Pulling the sackcloth off the noble's head, we held the black rod in front of his face, and as his eyes focused on the object, an otherworldly outcry of anguish and torment erupted from everywhere and nowhere. Sienkov's eyes rolled into the back of his head, his body shuddered violently before slumping back into the seat, and then an ominous silence settled upon the interior of the van. Greybass would later explain that what we'd used was a null rod, a potent piece of anti-psyker equipment, and that with its aid, we'd succeeded in evicting the puppeteering witch from Iosif's mind. So we have 5 days, or maybe fewer now, to foil Frolov's bloody grab for power, warn the royal family, and unearth the motivations behind our rival Ordos' support for the Grand Prince's machinations. To top it all off, Blackwater is driving us down into consortium territory, convinced he can secure their assistance. Like attracts like, I suppose. At our current rate of travel, we'll be meeting them early in the morning, and I need to finish a program of questioning for Sienkov before turning in for the night. Now that he's free of a foreign consciousness, I'm hoping he'll be more forthcoming. If he comes around, that is. In Vox Log